Life on Earth is in SOS mode. We need all hands on deck. Thank you for joining us on Radio Free Georgia's In Tune to Nature program. I'm host Carrie Freeman, coming to you in April of 2025 from Atlanta in the Muskogee Creek Territory and former range of the Red Wolf in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains. And today we're going to be talking about animal welfare. And when you hear the term animal welfare, you probably think cats, dogs, horses, and maybe pet parakeets. But there's an organization called Wild Animal Initiative that is expanding the notion of animal welfare to include wild, free-living animal individuals. My guest, Cat Kerr, is with Wild Animal Initiative and is here to talk about how we measure well-being in wild animals and why we haven't often done that in scientific research on a regular basis. And we'll share some stories about wild bird welfare and how scientists are helping sparrows live better lives, and what wild birds with bird flu are going through. Let me tell you about my guest and her organization. At the Wild Animal Initiative, they're working to accelerate progress in the emerging field of wild animal welfare science. To foster the growth of this community, they conduct scientific research, make grants, and provide support for scientists studying wild animal welfare. Their research priorities are finding out what wild animals' lives are like, how we can measure wild animal welfare, and what we can do to improve the lives of wild animals. Their website is wildanimalinitiative.org. Our guest, Cat Kerr, is the communications director at Wild Animal Initiative. Cat studied journalism and biology at University of Richmond, then earned her master's in nonprofit administration from University of Central Florida. She's worked in nonprofit communications since 2017, and before that, she was a journalist and science educator. Cat is located here in Atlanta, and also I know this because I ran into Cat eating with some animal activists at the vegan pizza place in Little Five Points, and was happy to hear that someone who worked at the Wild Animal Initiative lived here in Atlanta, as we have one of our founders of the founders of the Wild Animal Initiative was on the show 5 years ago, and so we're kind of overdue for a follow-up on this innovative group. So I invited Kat to join me in the studio. Let me turn her mic on. Yeah, welcome, Kat.
Hi, Carrie. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, happy to have you here. And to make a new friend of another animal advocate who lives in Atlanta.
Yeah, absolutely.
Cool. Well, as I mentioned before, when we think of welfare research, it would usually be on improving maybe human welfare or welfare of domesticated animals like dogs and cats and farmed animals in terms of reducing suffering or improving health. We've often overlooked the welfare of individual wild animals, haven't we, in favor of just supporting their populations at a group level. Why has science and policy largely ignored the welfare of wild or free-living animals?
I think this really goes back to a societal issue that I would love to see solved someday, which is that many people only care about the welfare of animals to the extent that giving them good welfare gives us some benefit from it.
Right.
So in the farmed animal space, we only care enough about the welfare of farmed animals so that we can use them as products, make sure they survive to give us an return on our investment. We're seeing them like commodities. In the case of companion animals like cats and dogs, other pets, we're getting joy out of our relationships with them. So we keep them happy, they make us happy. And then with wild animals, historically, people have seen them as either natural resources that we can use and gain something from, or more recently, I think they're seeing them as functions in an ecosystem rather than individuals. So I think policies around wild animals have just historically had that perspective, seeing these animals like resources or functions in an ecosystem and not so much as individuals.
Yeah.
And in science, there's a long history of belief that animals couldn't feel pain or didn't feel emotions, and they were just sort of these like things that responded to stimuli, but we weren't
kind of
paying
robotic of sorts.
Yeah.
You're thinking of like Rene Descartes and that whole, which I think that was just an excuse he had for wanting to experiment on animals. So he made up that very stupid idea that they just react like a clock or something when you touch them, but they're really not in pain. That's ridiculous. And I think he thought, that's my own theory, is that he thought he knew he was lying, but it helped people do animal experimentation, like apparently guilt-free for a little while.
Maybe so, yeah. And then later you had like Watson and Skinner just looking at conditioning animals and things like that. So I think we're coming from this legacy in science of not thinking about animals' emotions and subjective experiences. And so we're just starting to see that change, which is why Wild Animal Initiative exists, to advocate for that within science.
Yeah, I really like how you've explained that too, because and I like to see this from an animal rights perspective, because which basically an animal rights perspective, I think, is really saying that other animals have intrinsic value, like we as a human animal have intrinsic value. And so even if those animals are not going to directly benefit me, they're not my dog or some pig that somebody owns that they're trying to make money off of, they still matter and their welfare matters. And so that is kind of a new concept. And because also a lot of times with wild animals, also people might see them as pests. And so they think, oh, well, if I don't like them, then they don't matter also. Again, seeing everything through a very human lens is what our media and our religions and everything have cultivated in us. And I think with the animal advocacy movement and the environmental movement, we've been trying to open people up to more ecocentric, biocentric perspectives, but it's kind of difficult to do. But I mean, in some ways, I think there's also a reason we haven't focused on wild animal welfare that you could argue is a little bit humbling to us, which is that we might say, look, they're individuals who can take care of themselves. Like, I don't need to get involved in what they're doing, and I might not know what I'm doing. If I interfere, I might be to save one animal, I might be, causing the death of another animal who needed to eat them, or I just don't understand enough. So we can, if I'm thinking a little, if I'm complimenting humans in some way, I might say, for us to say maybe we should be kind of hands off with wild animals and not kind of bring them into our realm, I can kind of see an argument for that we might inadvertently, with our kindness, cause a ripple effect of problems. So what would you say to people who have a fear of unintended negative consequences, and instead think, like, well, let nature take its course, we shouldn't really get involved in what wild animals' lives are like?
I think there's kind of two things going on here. So to someone who thinks maybe we shouldn't get involved in nature, I would challenge them to think about, how do we get involved with human suffering that's natural, quote. Mm-hmm. So many diseases have just existed in nature for forever, or for centuries, things like that. But we would never say to somebody like, "Oh, your disease is natural, so
just
I'm not going to help you."
Just let it run its course through the whole community.
Right. That seems cruel and inhumane. And so if we look at it with an anti-speciesist view, then we would apply that same logic for intervening to cure a disease in a human to helping wild animals from their suffering as well. As for the unintended consequences, I mean, this is something that we think about a lot as well. And it's really the number one reason that there's no one intervention we can confidently advocate for yet, because we don't have enough research done to say that any certain intervention is like net positive, considering all the individuals, all the species involved in that population or ecosystem or something like that. But we also kind of want to challenge some traditional ideas about what the balance of the ecosystem means, because a lot of times that idea can be very subjective, and it's like we're trying to get, quote, back to some version of an ecosystem that benefits some people or something like that.
Or was like a pre-colonial notion of what nature used to look like before we had brought all these other species in, and we're also, as settlers, an invasive species of sorts, I like to say. Right. So that's subjective. Yeah, who chooses which version of nature? Yeah, like what's the original? There is no actual one way that nature is in any ecosystem, because it's always evolving. It has always been changing, and so rather than trying to achieve some kind of subjective balance in nature, what Wild Animal Initiative is interested in doing is increasing the average welfare for every individual in a system, or the net welfare in a system. Okay. And in terms of welfare, how is welfare assessed in wild animals? Like, what criteria do you use to determine what constitutes an animal living a good life?
There are several things that we can use to measure this kind of thing, but we want many more ways, which is part of the research that we're doing. So right now we have indicators that are kind of grouped into either behavioral indicators or physiological indicators. So we can look at an animal's behavior or something about their physiology, and we can infer something about their welfare, because we cannot measure welfare directly. It's not a metric itself.
Okay.
So no single indicator is really sufficient to assess an animal's welfare or population, so we have to look at multiple indicators and kind of give a holistic view of what's going on with the animal. So just some examples. How is the animal spending their time? That's called an activity budget in ecology or behavioral science. How much time are they spending resting or searching for food or eating or socializing? That can kind of give us a picture of their welfare.
I mean, if it seems out of whack, like they're frantically looking for food all the time and not resting, or resting too much and not eating or something.
Right. Exactly. Some others are just like, which fear or play behaviors are they exhibiting? Fear is often associated with negative welfare. Play is often associated with positive, though not all the time. Are there any symptoms of disease present? That's a clear one. If they're suffering from a disease, their welfare is probably pretty low.
Yeah.
So that could be something outward or something we have to measure within their body. Certain hormones are interesting. We can look at stress hormone levels, how they've changed over time. They're not like a one-to-one in the sense of like we might see high stress levels and that equals negative welfare. That's not necessarily true, but it's just one of these indicators that can help us understand the animal's full picture. And then things like body temperature or breathing rate, those are more physiological as well. So looking at all these kinds of things can help us.
Yeah.
And there are some assessments that have been used for captive animal welfare in like a farmed animal setting or a zoo setting, where it's almost like a questionnaire that somebody would fill out. Does the animal have access to certain things? Are they exhibiting certain behaviors? And we can't yet just use those exact assessments in the wild, but we're looking at those as kind of models of like what's possible to fill out some kind of assessment questionnaire for wild animals.
Like, do they have access? I like to also see the ecosystem as the animal's source of livelihood, right? And so, like, do they have access to food and water,
right?
Clean water in their just like in a cage, you would ask that question, but are they able? Like, if we cut down the trees and the other, that might have the seeds that they need, to eat or whatever.
Definitely. Yeah. Are their basic needs being met? And then above and beyond that, are there extra things in their environment that are bringing them joy, basically?
Yeah.
Or in the other direction, are there things that are causing them suffering? So that would be interesting. So we're working on kind of expanding our portfolio of indicators that are available that have been validated. So we're funding some research in those areas to try to have more options to assess welfare.
Yeah. And this is just an anecdote, but lately on my porch, I've been seeing this squirrel who I realized has only one eye. And his right eye seems to be missing, or it looks like his eye's kind of closed. But he looks like he's in great shape. And, like, his fur looks awesome. He's super cute. He's plump, because he's got my, basically my bird seed feeder is like a all-you-can-eat smorgasbord situation that he's enjoying. But I realized this when he was stopping and staring at me, because if I hold still on my porch while I'm working, some of the birds and squirrels kind of will reluctantly kind of eat in front of me, but they've got that eye on me, she can move. But I'm thinking about him, like, was he born with one eye and he just is visually impaired and he's managed his whole life to live a good life? Or did something tragic happen to him? And I'm wondering, how did he deal with the pain and suffering of losing that eye? And, like, how did he not get infection that killed him? I'm, like, wondering, what's this guy's story?
I would love to know. I don't think we have any research on one-eyed squirrels right now, but just this kind of
looks
curiosity.
Like he's doing. I mean, by my assessment of his fur and like the way his energy level is high. Like, I'm using my own, lay person's assessment that this looks like an animal I don't have to take to, a wildlife rescue place.
Right. Well, this is why it's really hard to measure welfare, because it's so subjective. So, like, a different individual squirrel with one eye might really have a hard time, and maybe they wouldn't be able to feed themselves. But this one that you've seen seems fine. So that's why we just need a lot more research done.
Yeah. But I think it's these interactions with these individual animals, maybe in our neighborhood or on hikes, that might give us an inkling into our own curiosity about wild animal welfare. just asking, some of these questions. Well, Kat, what are some successes your group Wild Animal Initiative has had in helping to jumpstart and support a robust discipline in wild animal welfare science?
Well, since we started about 6 years ago, we've had 3 core programs, which are research that we do ourselves, grants, we re-grant to other researchers around the world, and then outreach and services for scientists to kind of build a community.
Good.
So within those programs, some of the successes we've seen are just that there's such an enthusiasm among scientists to study wild animal welfare that we are able to sort of organize them as a community and as a cohort. And we have like an online network for them to connect with one another and share ideas or find collaborators for projects. And that has grown to more than 400 people. So
Awesome.
when we started, there was nothing like that for them to all connect over this principle in this field. So now that exists for them, and it's growing, which is really great. And then as far as us operating as a grantor, cumulatively we've funded 68 projects where researchers around the world are studying wild animal welfare. Most of those projects are in North America and Europe, but some are in Asia, Africa, and Australia as well. And especially right now, scientists really need funding in the U.S. because so many of the federal grants have been cut. So this is becoming more and more of an important program. Absolutely.
Yeah. Do you know some individuals who've had their research funding taken away? Have you heard about that?
Well,
you don't have to tell me their names. I'm just curious, like if there's chatter among your scientist community, like, oh no, I was doing this and now I can't.
Right. Fortunately, so far all of the grantees that we have already granted funds to, we haven't heard this from, but we are starting to get inquiries from people who are saying, I'm looking for alternative sources of funding now. Unfortunately, most of their projects aren't aligned with welfare study, so we're not always able to help. But we always encourage them, could you think about a different angle to work in a wild animal welfare part of this study?
Good.
And then maybe we'd be interested in funding it. So,
yeah, because I think I'm going to do another In Tune to Nature show on the cuts to science from the Trump administration, because that cuts across the conservation and wildlife work to climate change work, just to marine animal work. So it's such a huge it's affecting so many aspects of our life, or we'll see the negative effects of it in the future. So I do like to be supportive of scientists who are helping us understand the natural world better so that we can be better stewards, like what your group is doing.
Definitely, yeah. And then as far as outreach to the scientific community and kind of like spreading the word about this new field and what it can be, we've attended 60 scientific conferences over the past 6 years across the world.
An insane number.
Yeah, it's a lot of. It's a big part of what we do. We'll give talks or workshops and kind of rally people at these conferences. And we've also produced 8 peer-reviewed articles in scientific journals, and then teams that we've given grants to have produced 6 papers. So that's 14 new wild animal welfare papers that have come about because of our work.
That's awesome. And has there been any policy changes yet, or any tangible improvements to wildlife that that's come out of this, or do you think that's like coming later?
Not yet. Yeah, right. We're looking at a longer-term timeline because research is slow, and we need a lot more data before anything can really be concretely identified as a good intervention.
Yeah. But just even getting people in the pipeline to do this work at schools. Is it NYU that has a wild animal welfare program now? Because it was last summer that I went to a conference that they had, and it just is unusual that a wild animal welfare conference is even unusual. Because I've gotten into the field of compassionate conservation, which I think kind of overlaps, where instead of just the typical conservation research where they're looking at population levels of, let's say, deer or wolves or whatever, in this case, compassionate conservation takes kind of an animal rights or animal liberation approach that just says, I care about individual animals, not just the whole population. Like, I'm not going to go and kill a certain number of them just to reach some statistical ideal or something. So it applies some notions of individual rights to the wild animal world. And so in a way, the wild animal welfare kind of overlaps with that, I think. I don't know if you use the term compassionate conservation a lot.
There's definitely overlap. We see it as still separate from us, though, because we're just not motivated by the same things that conservationists are. They're still interested in managing populations and trying to achieve some kind of version.
And introduce species, invasive species is a big, conservation goal all the time, dealing with them.
Right, exactly. And so we're just motivated by a different thing, which is trying to make sure animals have the best lives they can, regardless of their species.
Well, on that note, one of the topics we wanted to talk about today was, of all the wild animals, we thought, well, let's talk about birds. And that's something that a lot of us are into, especially around Atlanta, because there's just so many trees and so many awesome birds. Can you tell us about the house sparrow project that Wild Animal Initiative has championed for the sparrows?
Yeah, so going back to what I was saying earlier in our conversation about how one of our priorities is to validate new ways to assess welfare. That's what this project is really about. So we're trying to figure out, can certain behaviors or vocalizations from house sparrows reliably tell us something about their welfare? If you don't know what a house sparrow is, if somebody listening isn't sure what that bird is, you have definitely seen them. They're a little songbird. They don't actually sing. They chirp. They're very chattery. They hang out in parking lots. You'll see them pecking at French fries or something. And if you're eating at a restaurant on like a patio, they're definitely on the ground there. They're just everywhere in the world.
And they're like, I looked them up too, just because of this show. So they're kind of gray with a little brown on them.
Yeah,
usually.
Yeah. The females are all brown, but some different browns, and then the males are brown with like a black spot and a white spot. If you look a picture of them,
and they're very common to North America, and so we see them a lot.
Exactly. Yeah. They're one of the most common birds in the world, they're just everywhere. There's billions of them, which is part of why we chose them for this study, because they're really easy to find. You don't have to go into the forest or the jungle. They're just probably in your backyard. They're everywhere, and so we're hoping that this study will produce its own insights, but also can serve as a model for future studies by other researchers. Yeah. And it's like almost no matter where they are in the world, they can do this study again and provide more data. So what we're doing is we've designed this experiment. I say we, but it's our research team, not me personally. We've designed this experiment where we're going to present birds at a set of field sites in Houston, Texas, with some different scenarios. So one scenario is an abundance of birdseed at the bird feeders.
Sounds great.
Yeah, exactly. Sounds great.
I know a one-eyed squirrel that would love that.
Yes. Yeah. Another one is the presence of a human. So the lead researcher herself is going to walk up to the feeder, see what happens. And based on prior research on just birds in general, and house sparrows specifically, we would kind of expect these different kinds of scenarios to make them feel really good or be scared or something like that. And so we're going to see what behaviors do they exhibit in those scenarios and what are their vocalizations during those scenarios. And then hopefully we can find some links between their expected welfare state and then the actual indicators that we're observing.
Oh. And so has anybody started doing this yet around Texas to see how the birds react to different feeder scenarios, birdseed scenarios, like with and without people? And
we're very close to that part of the study. So so far the lead researcher has set up the field sites. She's made sure she can control for all the variables she needs to. And just recently, a few weeks ago, she finally was able to band 30 birds. So this way she can identify each one individually, and she can see if there are like other factors that might be affecting their welfare by knowing which bird is doing what at what time.
So like if they'd come back to the same spot.
Exactly.
And if they go, because they also might get accustomed to her as the researcher. And like I think the birds and squirrels on my porch know that I seem to be okay, but my dog Elliot does not seem to be okay. But if a different person came to the porch, I'm sure the squirrels and birds wouldn't come because they don't know that person. So also I'm a known entity, and I think they trust me to a certain extent. So I don't know if that's part of what you're looking at, is just how they get accustomed to certain humans as opposed to others.
Yeah, it's not a question that we're exploring here, but I think she's going to have to think about that as well,
Yeah.
and probably figure out how to control for that. But she has a long career in animal
She
behavior
knows
studies, so she knows how to do this.
Yeah,
even if
you and I are both not scientists.
Exactly.
We're like communicators, but this is good for our audience because we're not making this overly scientific here. Yeah. Now, some people might feel like they're doing this all the time, like I am, like when they're watching their bird feeder, that they know what the bird's like, and or like some birds are demanding of them. They get more comfortable with them. Like my mom, where they used to live, there was a cardinal who used to come up to her kitchen window if she had not put the bird seed out. You know, he would come asking like, "Hey, lady, where's the bird seed?" So they get more bold too in certain scenarios.
True, yeah.
You know, and then my parents would see them feeding their young every year, and sometimes the little birds would be actually bigger than the parents, would look kind of hysterical, the parents trying to feed this huge teenager.
Yeah.
But anyway, so I do think humans enjoy like looking at these scenarios ourselves. We're not scientists, but we are gauging what we think the birds and squirrels, or, you know, in our own communities want from us. And usually I feel like they prefer us to provide some food but stay away, and water, but stay away from them. You know?
Yeah, maybe so. I mean, I don't know, maybe every bird is different, but speaking of people making these own observations for themselves and just having curiosity, I think in a way everyone can be a scientist, even if they're not publishing papers.
Exactly.
And if anyone's like really interested in contributing to science with their observations of birds, we personally don't do like citizen science projects, but there are many of them out there where you can look for a project that some researcher is doing, and you can add your own data to the data set. So it could be about birds in your backyard, other wild animals. So
is that really like cool the iBird app? Am I making that up?
No, you're not making it up. That is real.
It sounds familiar to me, and I probably downloaded it and haven't used it.
Yeah. I think they might collaborate with some of these kinds of projects.
You can report the kind of birds you see around, and that leads to kind of people understanding where they are at different times of the year, or different kinds of things like that.
Right.
And thank you for joining us, continuing to join us on Radio Free Georgia. This is In Tune to Nature. I'm host Carrie Freeman, continuing my show about unique research projects on how to improve the welfare and lives of wild birds with Cat Kerr, Communication Director at the research nonprofit Wild Animal Initiative. Their website is wildanimalinitiative.org. Cat, we were talking about a house sparrow project, and one of the reasons you picked the house sparrow was because they're very ubiquitous around lots of places, but especially here in North America. But I know that they can also be birds that some people don't like, or they can be a little controversial, or are they native or not, and should they even be here? And so that was part of your concern, right, about wanting people to better understand a bird that sometimes gets maligned or mistreated.
Definitely, yeah. So from a scientific perspective, it's just kind of the way we're approaching this is if we pick a species that has many, many individuals in the world, and then if we can identify some intervention that would improve the welfare of individuals of that species, then we can improve the welfare of many, many individuals. So we try to prioritize the most common animals when we can. And the house sparrow is definitely an example of that. But like you said, they are quite controversial. They were introduced to North America and some other parts of the world. They're originally from Eurasia. And they interact with some other birds in North American ecosystems who are beloved by conservationists and ornithologists and just birders. And so those groups have often felt a lot of animosity toward the house sparrow.
Because the house sparrow is a little more aggressive than some of the songbirds that people like.
They tend to outcompete the songbirds that people like, especially the eastern bluebird, which is a bird that I love as well.
Yes,
but
very pretty.
People see the house sparrow as an enemy of these other birds. And they're just because they're a bird that thrives in many, many environments. So they're just doing their
very
house sparrow
adaptable
thing. Exactly. Yeah. And so, we're kind of interested in maybe challenging people's ideas of which species are good or bad and why, and hoping that people understand, for better or for worse, the house sparrow is here, and it's a bird just like any other bird, and so we'd like those birds to have good lives. Of course, we'd also like the other birds in their systems, in their ecosystems, to have good lives. So the goal would be to find ways to improve the average welfare for all these birds in these ecosystems.
Yeah. Would any welfare project ever be about the interactions, the competition between different bird species? That's kind of a controversial topic because then you get into, especially if one of the birds is considered introduced species, and then you're going to have a group of people that thinks we should eradicate them, and which is kind of a never-ending violence cycle there. Like in terms of, could humans get involved in helping the bluebird work and live, in harmony with the house sparrow? I mean, I don't know.
Yeah, maybe so. We'd love to find out.
Yeah.
I think in conservation biology, there's a lot of studies about population dynamics and trade-offs between species, interested in like what helps one species proliferate and survive versus another. So that's kind of covered, we think, and that's why we think this new field, wild animal welfare science, is needed to find out, but how are these things actually affecting the subjective experiences of the individual birds?
So it's also about coming from their perspective. What makes their life better, or what do they want in an ecosystem? What makes them happier or helps them thrive?
Exactly.
Because I'm always interested also, should we even be feeding them at a bird feeder? Like I go back and forth, and sometimes I don't feed the birds and squirrels, and then sometimes I do. And so I'm not quite sure the extent to which I should be doing that, and so that's maybe always a question. And perhaps some of this research about the house sparrows and us kind of interacting with them by providing food gets to some of that. Is this improving their welfare, or maybe not? Should they be foraging on their own?
It's a great question. Yeah, there's a lot of interesting questions around bird feeding. So.
Yeah. Well, Kat, in reading your blog on the wildanimalinitiative.org site, I saw a posting about bird flu and how it causes the lives of wild birds to suffer. What do we know about the effects of the latest bird flu outbreak on individuals? I mean, a lot of times we talk just about, it's killed X number and it's spread to this species. But how do wild birds experience bird flu? Like, is it like having a cold? Is it like having a flu? I mean, I don't know if we know how much suffering is involved.
Right. I think we still need a lot of research on this, but we can at least observe some of the symptoms that they suffer from, which are things like swelling of their head. They might have tremors or a loss of balance. Sometimes their wings are sort of droopy, so they're not able to fly correctly. Or they might have like respiratory and digestive issues. So yes, it's killing mass amounts of birds. Hundreds of millions of wild birds have died from this disease. But in the process of dying from the disease, they are also suffering, which is what we're hoping to alleviate. But we need a lot more research before we can figure out how to do that for them.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask. Is there anything that humans can do to ease the suffering of wild birds and other animals with bird flu?
Right now, as far as an average individual person, there's probably not. But your question earlier about bird feeders is highly relevant because, which is on net better, to feed them and provide a source of reliable, healthy food, or to take away that food source, but you're also taking away a situation where they can easily spread disease among one another. So it's a big question, and it probably depends on the factors in your individual backyard, how many birds you're getting, how many feeders do you have, how often do you clean the feeders and disinfect them. There's just a lot of questions.
Right, because we could be inadvertently spreading bird flu if we have just the one feeder and it's real tight, and then a lot of birds come all together, or just a very small water source too, and then they're all kind of using that water source, and if we don't clean it out that often, as opposed to maybe throwing bird seed around the yard where it's spread out a little bit more and it doesn't have them interacting as closely, perhaps.
Right, yeah, maybe so. If anyone listening does have a bird feeder and they're interested in this question, just to give you kind of a benchmark, Bonnie, who is the lead researcher on our house sparrow project, because she has set up these bird feeders to attract the birds, she's completely cleaning them out and disinfecting them like multiple times a week to try to prevent any bird flu spread. So that's at least one thing that you could try to do.
Right, and a lot of us aren't going to be that diligent, so we might ask ourselves, if we're not going to be that diligent, maybe we shouldn't be feeding the birds while there's a bird flu outbreak.
Yeah, it's a great question.
Yeah. Kat, I also saw on your Wild Animal Initiative blog research about the causes of death in wild animals. Can you tell me some things we've learned so far about what the leading causes of death are for wild birds of various ages?
Yeah, so it seems to be the case that across life stages, birds die from the same kinds of things. So juvenile birds, adult birds tend to die from the same kinds of things. But many more juveniles die. If you think about a brood of ducklings, for example, I'm thinking about right around the corner, Inman that little park over there
that has with the pond.
Exactly.
Yeah, Springvale Park, I think it might be called.
Yes, that's
with
another
the little
one.
Fountains.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
So last spring.
Oh, right. There's two different parks.
Yeah,
I know what you're thinking.
Pocket Park, Inman something.
Yeah, where they put up all the signs that says, "Hey, we're feeding the birds here. Do not feed the birds and the fish and everybody. We've got them feeding a very specific diet." And there's like a bunch of signs in that little pond, so you cannot miss it.
Right. So that's the one I'm thinking of. And last spring, around this time, I remember seeing some ducklings, because there's ducks who live there. And there were like 10 ducklings following this one duck. And I walk there all the time, so week by week I was seeing the ducklings disappear.
Oh, I know.
And the last time I saw them, there were 4 remaining, and I don't know how many really survived to adulthood. But this is just a product of evolution where many species have a strategy of having many young, knowing that they won't all survive, most of them will not. And so when you see the very cute ducklings or whatever bird species it might be with a bunch of chicks, most of them are not going to survive to adulthood. So I think based on what I've seen with juveniles and adult birds, the number one cause of death is predation.
Right. They're just very vulnerable, and especially when one mother has so many babies, and especially when they're on the ground like that, as opposed to having the birds that have the nests up with just a few chicks.
Right, yeah. And then, other common causes are disease. There's many. We talked about bird flu, but there's many other diseases out there. And starvation. So feeding birds is often very helpful for helping them avoid that cause of death, at least. And then in areas with people, like urban and suburban areas, a lot of raptors, birds of prey, they're dying from rat poisons because they will prey upon a poisoned mammal, and the poison bioaccumulates to the raptor.
Wasn't that the case of that famous bird in New York City? I forget his name.
Yeah, yes. Flaco, the eagle owl.
They realized what killed him was that people are always poisoning the rats and the mice, and then the Flaco was, that's his prey, and so then, whenever we put poison in the world, it doesn't disappear.
Right.
Let's just put it in lead ammunition and just other toxins and chemicals that we put in the world. It gets into everybody somehow.
Yes. I'm thrilled to see that the state of California has banned anticoagulant rat poisons.
Wow.
Because they're coming at it from a conservation perspective, and so many other species were ingesting these poisons indirectly that they have decided, for conservation reasons, to no longer have those available in California. And I really hope other places take that lead.
Yeah.
But we do need another way maybe to manage rats that doesn't cause them suffering or other animals. So that's a whole other conversation.
Right, because we're not at the Wild Animal Initiative and in animal rights in general, we're not trying to play favorites and go, I think you're cute and or you're magnificent, and so I'm going to help you out. But if you're a rat and a lot of people don't like you, or if you're a snake, I don't care about you. That's the way humans have tended to make decisions about other animals. But we can recognize that all kinds of insects and rats and mice have a place in the world, and they are sentient beings as well. And we need to respect they're just trying to live their lives.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. So was there anything that this research on how birds are dying that indicates how we should be improving things? Like, are we hitting them with our cars, or, is it that we're building too many roads, or our cars are too big?
There are a lot of things where humans have created some technology or done something or built something, and that thing seems to be a hazard to birds.
Yeah.
Another one, like you mentioned, cars, that's a big one. But another one is glass, especially in high-rise buildings.
Oh, yes.
Some cities like New York have now offered incentives or put restrictions on the types of glass that new construction has for the sake of birds, because millions of them die from collisions with buildings.
And it especially can happen at night because of the lighting that we put in buildings.
Right.
And so that you can also change the lighting or try to have like dark buildings.
Yeah. So I'd love to see some of that happening in Atlanta.
Yes.
But with anything like this, where it seems so easy, if we just stop doing this thing that we've started that we know harms an animal, we stop driving or we stop building these buildings, whatever it might be. Well, what are they going to die from otherwise? And is that thing worse or better?
That's a welfare question.
Exactly. And so it's not just about survival. It's also about their actual experience of living and dying. And that's kind of what we want to find out.
I guess there's also a sense that a lot of us have that if we are the cause of them suffering, then we have the responsibility to get involved in like changing our road system or our vehicles or driving at a different speed versus something that naturally might happen to them that I don't have as much control over or something. It's a sense, I guess, of moral responsibility. Because when I was in, just quick sad story, when I was in the Everglades and I saw this down near the town of Flamingo, I saw this dead heron on the road. So I pulled over and just to make sure about him. And he was dead, and so I moved his body out of the road and, like, put him as far as I could off the road because also I didn't want the raptors because you could see there were a lot of vultures, actually, around there. And I didn't want them getting in the road. And it was already just sad enough to pick up this huge bird and then put him off to the side. And then I was talking to one of the rangers about it, and he said, yeah, a lot of times people with the big RVs, what probably happened is that their cars have gotten so big, our SUVs and our recreational vehicles, that birds, when they try to fly over the road, the trucks or the cars are too big and they hit them. So that's an example of a design. And then also on the way back on that same street, suddenly I realized at the same spot there was another dead bird, and this time it was a vulture. The bird, he or she, was a vulture. And I realized to my dismay that it's the same spot and that I could barely see that they had really cleared out that bird. Like they had done their work in scavenging, but that just made me so sad. Like, even though I tried to intervene and get the bird off the road so another bird wouldn't be hit, somehow a vulture did get hit in that same area because we killed a bird there from a vehicle. So this is just like a spiral of things that I'm noticing. Not that I couldn't have been responsible with my car. I'm sure I'm killing all kinds of insects and different things, or it could have been me that at some point is going to hit the bird. So we all have to take our responsibility for this. But just recognizing, what we're doing, and every time we build a road and we drive vehicles on it, we're putting other animals at risk. And then when they die on the side of the road, that puts more animals at risk. So
definitely. I feel that same sense of personal obligation. What can I change about my actions?
That leads to my last wrap-up question. So let me just ask that question. Kat, do you have any tips you've learned from Wild Animal Initiative research about what people can do if they want to help improve the lives of wild animals? And we can expand it out, beyond birds if you want.
I wish I had something as concrete to say as the parallel to farmed animal advocacy, which is go vegan. I wish there was just something that every individual person could do that is clearly helping the situation.
Yeah.
That is not the case yet. So,
in terms of what you can totally prove and document from a scientific standard.
Exactly. We might be another 5, 10 or more years away from an answer that is that clear. But there are still some other things you can do that I think will kind of prepare the world for the research to be done, which are stay curious and kind of be willing to question your assumptions about what's good or bad in the wild.
Yeah.
So many of us are, for a long time, myself included, we believe certain things about nature that actually are not based in science, but are based in philosophy and very subjective and cultural ideals about the wild. And so I think the more we can all question our beliefs, like why do I believe that? Is that based in science? And start to work toward a society that sees nature in a way that is based in science, I think we'd all be better off. So that's one thing. And then, just spreading the word about kind of normalizing this idea that wild animals are constituents of our cities and states and countries, and so they deserve moral consideration as well. When we're making new policies and laws, are we considering how those policies and laws will affect wild animals, even if they're not directly things that are going to be happening out in the wild or something like that? The more we can just normalize that line of thinking and the way of asking those questions, I think that will help wild animals long term as well.
I like that, just the idea of thinking differently and not just approaching things from the same human standpoint or the same stories we've always told ourselves about certain animals. We can question, is it true, or is that steak dangerous, or yeah, should I be out, or even just should I be out here like on my mountain bike right now? And if it's a certain time of day when the animals tend to be foraging, like should I maybe not be there at that time? Should I give them a break? And just like things, what would be courteous to other animals who are trying to live their lives in places that sometimes we're just recreating in.
Definitely, yeah. I think everyone can ask those questions about their individual interests, the way they spend their time. You know, there's an endless number of ways that you can consider wild animals in your daily life.
Yeah, and if there's certain times when there's more babies around, we can act a lot more carefully during that time. Or if certain animals you see more turtles crossing the road at a certain time of year, can we try to get our local community to shut down that road for a period of their migration or something like that? Even though these are kinds of accommodations we haven't tended to make quite as often, except maybe in a national park. But we could be doing that, or petitioning to get a wildlife crossing in that area. Like if we see places where we notably can tell wild animals are not thriving and it's dangerous for them or it's painful because of something we're doing, what could we build? Could we change the infrastructure? Could we decrease the speed limit? Just start prioritizing them at all, actually, would be good, instead of just seeing that as expected collateral damage of our lives.
Right, yeah, definitely.
That's right. All right. Well, I wanted to also, before I wrap up, I wanted to just make my own little announcement, because I had been listening to NPR the other day. Let me pull up the article, and this was from April 17th, 2025, and the title was "Destroying Endangered Species Habitat Wouldn't Count as Harm Under Proposed Trump Rule." So the article says the Trump administration is proposing to significantly limit the Endangered Species Act's power to preserve crucial habitats by changing the definition of one word, and the word is harm. And it says on Wednesday the administration proposed a rule that would essentially prohibit only actions that directly hurt or kill actual animals, not the habitats they rely on. If finalized, the change could make it easier to log, mine, and build on lands that endangered species need to thrive. And then there's a whole host of, activists or people from the Center for Biological Diversity that are, saying habitat loss is the biggest single cause of extinction. And they see this as callous and reckless, this notion that you can, so long as you're not physically harming a bird, like punching them in the face or something, but it's okay to cut down the trees or ruin their ecosystem as their livelihood. So, and the Endangered Species Act is just a gem of our, environmental movement, and it's been so successful. And so the idea that we would allow such a major change and make it only about, oh, did you observe an actual animal dying? Well, if you didn't, then we haven't really harmed them. So I wanted to let people know there is a public comment period. And I'm going to post this on the Facebook page for In Tune to Nature, because I think with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, they're allowing the public to make a comment. So I am going to share that I do not want them to change the notion of what harm means under the Endangered Species Act, but people can choose to post whatever you want on that. And I don't know the extent to which they'll listen to what we have to say. I know they're making a lot of changes in the leadership of these organizations due to the Trump regime. But we do I feel like we should be speaking out whenever there's a change proposed that affects other animals. They can't speak for themselves, and we have to do that, speaking for them. So that's something to be thinking about. I don't know if you wanted to comment on that, Kat. This is just an extra thing I added to the end of the show.
Yeah, just I think coming at it from a perspective of wild animal welfare science, it's just different from a conservation perspective. But I can still see how this affects the welfare of like many, many individuals, regardless of species, because the habitat for an endangered species is also the habitat for many, many common species.
Yes.
And so, yeah, we should be thinking about
for mentioning that. I should have. That reminds me that a lot of times I think one of the errors of the way we've set up our wildlife quote unquote management is that it's focused on endangered species protection. And if you're not endangered, you're really almost like open game to all kinds of threats and you're really not that protected. So there's a whole ecosystem that gets protected by the endangered species that it keeps the whole ecosystem of the whole community alive. And if we start to damage that ecosystem, then a lot of other animals will become threatened and extinct down the road. So, that's a big concern. So just be thinking about these proposed changes, and if people are interested in making a comment on the website. Well, that's the end of our show, but I want to thank you, Cat Kerr, for being with us on Radio Free Georgia's In Tune to Nature program. Thanks for the work you and your team at Wild Animal Initiative do in pioneering welfare research for free-living wild animal individuals.
Yeah, thank you so much, Carrie, and thanks for everyone's support.
And to our listeners, thank you for tuning in to Tune to Nature, broadcasting every Wednesday at 6 p.m. Eastern Time, online at wrfg.org and on Atlanta radio station 89.3 FM. We post action items, news, and podcasts on the show's website, facebook.com/intunetonature. The views and opinions expressed on this show do not necessarily reflect those of WRFG, its board, staff, or volunteers. I'm one of those volunteers. I'm host Carrie Freeman, asking you to please support independent, non-commercial media like Radio Free Georgia. And remember to take care of yourself and others, including other species, like the wild animals we share our communities with. Thank you for listening. Cheers.